Back in March of 1872, a Kansas farmer made a grisly discovery while working on his property. The body of a newborn infant, wrapped in calico with its little throat cut from ear to ear. A few weeks later, another decomposed body was discovered just due south of the neighboring town of Oswego, this time a grown man. Although animals had been at the corpse, it was clear that the victim's throat had likewise been slashed, in addition to having the back of his head caved in. Skip ahead to October of that same year, and yet another body was discovered. Same county that the baby had been found in, and much like the previous victim, this cadaver was suffering from a cut throat and blunt force trauma to the back of his head. And those are just the bodies. Plenty more people in that same area left home never to be seen again. Take James Longcore, for example. He and his 19-month-old daughter left Montgomery County, Kansas in the fall of 1872. Mr. Longcore had recently been widowed and was headed back home to Iowa. Sadly, neither he or his daughter would make it. And I could go on and on. Benjamin Brown, William McCrotty, Henry McKenzie, William York, all of them traveling along the Osage Trail there in southeastern Kansas, and all of them seemingly vanishing without a trace. If that's not creepy enough for you, a paper out of Oswego published a story during this same period describing some rather eerie occurrences. Locals claim hearing ghastly screams and moans coming from the dark prairie, and even seeing an ominous wagon speeding across the horizon in the dead of night. Hell, by 1873, so many folks had gone missing that travelers began avoiding the trail altogether. But then again, this was the frontier, and people often went missing when they ventured out into the great unknown. Could it have been hostile Native Americans, maybe roving bands of outlaws, or was it something far more sinister? A murderous family like something straight out of a Rob Zombie movie known as the Bloody Benders. My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza. Dr. William Henry York left his home near Independence, Missouri on March 3, 1873. And when he failed to return, his wife Mary grew nervous. She reached out to family, and not long thereafter, two of York's brothers, one of whom was a colonel in the army, began their search. They and a posse questioned homesteaders, combed thickets, and even dragged a few creeks and rivers, but to no avail. By the start of April, the worst was assumed, but still they kept on a-looking, eventually reaching the Bender homestead, just a few miles northeast of Cherryville, Kansas. Now, the Benders were German immigrants who had settled there in Labette County in late 1870. And in time, they opened up sort of a combination store/inn right there on their property. A place where travelers could stop for a hot meal and hopefully catch a few Z's. By the way, this cabin was very tiny, just 16 feet by 24 feet. The Benders slept in the back behind what's often described as a large curtain. In all actuality, it was a repurposed canvas wagon cover. And up front is where the weary travelers would rest and re-up on provisions. The patriarch John Sr., also known as Paul Bender, was a rather large man in his mid-50s, described by neighbors as a profane and hideous brute. Paul spoke mostly in German in a very low guttural tone, almost as if he was grunting, and according to a neighbor, he was also heard speaking French on occasion, sort of a weird combination. Depending on the source, Paul was either of medium height or well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a burly build. Both his beard and hair were long and unruly, and he walked stooped over, with a downcast appearance. So yeah, all in all, just a big ray of sunshine. His alleged wife, Ma Bender, was a few years younger, but had an even meaner disposition than her old man, along with a hair-trigger temper to boot. Some claim she was tall and well-built, others that she was very sparse, almost wiry, with plain features, and that her hair was dark with a touch of gray. They also claim that Ma talked at a very fast pace. About the only thing faster than her speech, according to the neighbors, was her temper. And then you've got the two kids, John Jr. and Kate. John was in his early 20s and considered to be feeble-minded, had a facial tic and would often burst out laughing for no apparent reason. Still, though, he was thought to have been one of the more sociable members of the family. And finally, we've got young Kate Bender, a self-described spiritualist. Now, spiritualism as a religious movement got its start in the 1840s. Its adherents believed that the living could contact the dead, and they frequently attempted to do so by holding seances. And Kate Bender was no exception. She would sometimes give lectures there in Kansas under the very awesome name of Professor Miss Katie Bender, as well as advertising her services as a medium and healer. She also had a few, well, let's just say unconventional views. In addition to thinking that she could heal the sick and make contact with the dead, Kate was also a very strong proponent of free love. incestuous relationships, and even the idea that human beings have a moral right to commit murder. According to at least one source, she was also a communist, didn't agree with children receiving an education, and believed that she was Jesus Christ reincarnate. Had me at free love, but very quickly lost me at the incest and other batshit crazy beliefs. Now, Kate, much like her brother, was very social and would often attend dances and other events in neighboring Cherryville. As far as her appearance, well, it all depends on who you ask. According to some, she was blonde, and according to others, she was a redhead. Most accounts do mention that Kate was rather beautiful, though. A, quote, buxom, good-looking country gal, end quote. Down where I'm from, that's what we call corn-fed. Another description says that she was, quote, voluptuously molded, with a tigerish grace that few men could resist. Full disclosure, but there are other accounts describing her as a, quote, infernal hag, and even a person of rather repulsive appearance. One source even claimed that Kate was dirty and saucy. Now we're talking. We will touch on this a bit more, but there have been some serious questions as to whether or not Paul and Ma Bender were truly married. And if so, were John and Kate Paul's children or just Ma's from a previous relationship? Or were they related at all? Mystery likewise surrounds John Jr. and Kate. Were they really brother and sister, or as many have theorized, were they a couple, or both? We'll get to their true identities here in a bit, but needless to say, we're not exactly dealing with the most normal people in the world, right? Even by Kansas standards. Now remember, Colonel York and his men were busy looking for his brother, the doctor. And like I said earlier, their search soon led them to the Bender homestead, where almost immediately upon arrival, they were berated by Ma Bender. She strongly denied knowledge of the doctor's whereabouts and even accused the colonel of harassing her family for no good reason. Finally, daughter Kate intervened and admitted that the good doctor had indeed been there just a few weeks prior, that she had personally served him dinner, after which he simply departed and went along his merry little way. When one of the posse men asked if she could possibly use her psychic powers to determine the doctor's location, she responded by falling into a trance. Not for long, though. According to Kate, the spirits refused to speak up with so many men present. She proposed that the colonel return the following day, alone, and maybe then she could figure out where his brother was. Wink, wink. John Jr. then suggested that they search an area near Drum Creek where he claimed to have previously been shot at. But when the posse rode out to investigate, all they managed to find was a dead pig. A buried dead pig. What the hell, man? This is such a weird story. Anyway, from there, they concentrated their search more towards the town of Cherryville. Now, that creepy little visit occurred on April 3rd, 1873. Skip ahead a month later, and a passing neighbor noticed that the Bender house looked to be abandoned. Kind of. I mean, a calf was found starved to death just outside the barn, and a pig tied inside a pen was likewise starved. But as for the Benders themselves, they were nowhere to be seen. Neither was their wagon or team of horses. The curious neighbor, a guy by the name of Tolles, approached the cabin and knocked. When nobody answered, he peeped through a window, and what he saw was just a tad bit disturbing. Just a very chaotic scene with clothing and other items strewn all about the interior. Almost as if the Benders had either been robbed or forced to leave their home in a rush. A few days later, Tolles returned with some buddies, and when they forced their way inside, they were greeted with the rotten stench of death. They also noticed at least a dozen bullet holes puncturing the walls and ceiling. Finally, when the smell became unbearable, they took a look down in the cellar, which oddly enough, at first glance, appeared to be covered in slime. Upon closer inspection, however, they realized what they thought was slime was instead blood. A lot of blood, just absolutely covering the walls and floor of the cellar. Gotta imagine the flies and maggots were pretty thick as well. Now by this point, they were still thinking that maybe some sort of a disaster had fallen upon the Benders. Long story short, they went to town and came back with reinforcements, including the aforementioned Colonel York and an investigator by the name of Thomas Beers. They too inspected the inside of the cabin, and it didn't take long for Colonel York to locate some eyeglasses that belonged to his missing brother. He also peered down into the cellar, but despite all that blood, it was empty, so he continued his search outside. That's when he and investigator Beers noticed a slight depression in the garden. York began probing with a wagon rod till he hit something solid, and when the rod was removed, it had what appeared to be bits of human remains stuck to the end of it. So they started digging. First body they found was that of a man, partially decomposed and wearing nothing but an undershirt. And sure enough, once the head was uncovered, the body was positively identified as Dr. York. Much like many of the victims that I discussed in the intro, the back of his skull had been caved in and his throat was cut from ear to ear. By late afternoon, a crowd numbering close to 1,000 descended upon the homestead as the men continued to dig. And sure enough, they discovered yet another body right there next to where York was buried. Turns out it was Hank McKenzie. He had gone missing months prior, and he too appeared to have had his head caved in. And on it went, just one body after another. Most of the victims had been stripped naked save for an undershirt. Some were reportedly mutilated, and by mutilated I do mean their genitals. And to a man, they all had the same type of injuries to the back of their heads and their throats slashed. All except for one, that is. Consider this a friendly warning, but what you're about to hear is extremely disturbing and not for the faint of heart. If you need to hit that skip forward button a few times, I certainly won't blame you. But yeah, one of the bodies they discovered was George Longcore. Remember, he's the guy I spoke of earlier who was headed to Iowa with his 19-month-old daughter, Mary Ann. And sadly, she was found buried right alongside her daddy. While Mr. Longcore had the usual markings of a slit throat and bashed noggin, little Mary bore no physical signs of damage. That said, her hands, which were still covered with mittens, were tightly grasping the clods of dirt and clay. It's theorized that Mary was buried alive and she had struggled to dig her way out. Now, sources do vary as to how many bodies were located. In addition to the garden, there was also a fruit orchard where they found additional victims. They even found one guy who had been dumped into an abandoned well. But the best number I can find seems to be a total of 9 cadavers, and that's including the baby. But it's not including all those other bodies that had previously been found in nearby counties. There's no definitive proof that they too were victims of the Benders, but I do think it's likely. As I'm sure you can imagine, an altogether different type of search soon materialized. What had begun as a rescue was now a full-blown manhunt. A manhunt that we will discuss in just a moment, as well as the true identity and probable fate of the Benders. First, though, I would like to circle back to the victims, or more specifically, how they were killed. I mean, obviously they had their heads caved in, right? But how exactly did that occur, and with what? Well, first of all, I should point out that several hammers were located inside the cabin, ranging in size from the type used by shoemakers all the way up to a heavy sledge. It's thought that the victims were seated at the dinner table with that curtain directly behind them. Somewhere during the course of the evening, either Paul Bender or John Jr. would sneak up from the other side of the curtain and smack him in the back of the head with one of those hammers. Another member of the family, possibly Kate, would then rush in and cut their throats before the victims were shoved into the cellar to bleed out. Later on, they'd move them outside under the cover of dark and bury them. Now that's mostly just speculation, but believe it or not, there were a few close calls. People that nearly fell prey to the Benders, but miraculously made it out alive. Case in point, a guy by the name of Charles Hallett. He was having dinner there at the Bender place one day when he heard a noise and quickly turned around, only to find someone sneaking up from behind with a hammer. Mr. Hallett drew his revolver, and the mystery man, either Paul or John Jr., stammered something about fixing a loose nail, to which Hallett replied, "Well, fix it away from me." And then, of course, there's the infamous gunfighter John Wesley Hardin. Now, the story I'm about to share is apocryphal. Hardin would never mention it himself in his biography, but apparently he and a cousin spent a night there at the Benders when they were passing through the area. They too were seated with their backs to the curtain, but Hardin grew nervous, picked up his plate, and moved to the other side of the table. Early the next morning, they continued their journey back to Texas, never fully realizing how close they came to meeting their maker. Like I said, this is not something that Hardin ever said publicly. It comes from an interview given by his family long after his death. But if it's true, it does give a little more credence to the idea that the Benders' M.O. was smashing their victim's head in from behind that curtain. Also, what a shame that Hardin didn't just jerk iron and clean house, right? Dude killed dozens of people throughout the course of his life. He had one shot at redeeming himself, and nothing. Damn it, John Wesley. Now, it's almost certain that the Benders hauled ass after that first visit from Colonel York. That being the case, they had one hell of a head start over their pursuers. About the only evidence they left behind was that wagon, which ended up being located near the town of Thayer. Still, though, investigators were able to track them all the way to St. Louis, but unfortunately, that's where the trail went cold. Colonel York offered up a reward of $1,000, and the governor of Kansas did the same. Several people were arrested, but despite suspicion, there was just no way of linking them to the murders. Stories would come in occasionally, news of the Benders hiding out in Indian territory or even trying to make their way back to Europe, but try as they might, investigators just couldn't find them. And to this day, their fate remains a mystery. There are theories, though. Boy, howdy are there. My favorite is that the Benders escaped in a hot air balloon and made it all the way to Mexico before a storm blew them into the Gulf. Not making this up, by the way. They ended up falling out of the balloon onto the deck of a ship, killing all of them except for John Jr., and even then, he only lived long enough to give a deathbed confession. Speaking of deathbed confessions, at least one of the many vigilantes hunting down the Benders would himself give a dying testimony that he and his cohorts did indeed locate the murderous family. They found them in the territories, lynched them, and burnt their bodies. And believe it or not, there are many other stories suggesting that the Benders fell prey to vigilante justice. Probably the best known told by none other than Laura Ingalls Wilder, the author of Little House on the Prairie. She and her family lived near Independence, not far from the Benders, and she even claimed to have paid a visit to their inn when she was a young girl. What's more, her father allegedly took part in the search. According to Wilder, quote, Paul always said in a strange tone of finality, they will never be found. They were never found, and later I formed my own conclusions why, end quote. I guess the idea is that the posse found them, and rather than letting the courts decide, they instead dished out a little frontier justice of their own. And yeah, maybe, but if true, I do find it weird that everyone remains so hush-hush about it. We're talking the Kansas frontier in the mid-1870s. Death and vigilante justice weren't exactly frowned upon. And then there's the matter of that $2,000 reward. That would have been life-changing money back in those days, and nobody even attempted to collect on it. As far as Wilder is concerned, it's pretty clear that she fabricated the story about her father. Turns out they moved out of Kansas a few years before the Benders were even found out, and at the time of the manhunt, they were living in Wisconsin, so I highly doubt her daddy was one of the vigilantes. Now, there are some who think that the Benders split up and that John Jr. and Kate eventually settled in Glenwood Springs, Colorado. You can even find their graves there at the same cemetery where Doc Holliday is buried. The only problem is, despite being German, these are almost certainly not the same Benders who resided in Kansas. Also, what are the odds that they'd have thousands of dollars on their head and not even bother hiding under an alias? This is the Old West we're talking about. 9 times out of 10, all you had to do was get a haircut, change your name, and move 2 counties over, and you were pretty much free and clear. I could be wrong, but I just don't think it's probable that they would continue living under their real names. At least not somewhere so close to the scene of the crime. Of course, that's assuming that Bender was their real name to begin with, which we will get to very shortly. Regardless, the Kate Bender who lived over there in Glenwood Springs was about as far from a serial killer as you could hope to find. According to everything I read about the lady, she was an absolute pillar of the community. The only connection she had to Kansas was her husband having worked at Fort Leavenworth back in 1865. Now, there was another murderous family there on the frontier, the Kelly family, who also bore a very strong resemblance. Much like the Benders, the Kellys were comprised of an older married couple and their 2 adult children, a son and a daughter. They operated a saloon in what's now the Oklahoma Panhandle, and instead of hiding behind a curtain, they situated their guests atop a large trap door. When the signal was given, the door would fling open and they'd fall into the cellar, after which they'd be finished off with an axe. All total, I think they killed somewhere around 11 people, and when they were finally found out, they were lynched by vigilantes. Now, this occurred in early 1888, so about 15 years after the Benders disappeared. And once again, despite the similarities, including the daughter being named Kate, their ages are just a little too far off. Now, this is my second time covering the Bloody Benders, and on the previous installment, this is pretty much where we left off. The Benders just vanished into the wind, and nobody knows what ultimately became of them. Hell, at that time, nobody even knew for sure that their surname was truly Bender. And like I alluded to earlier, rumors still persist that John Jr. and Kate were common law married, as opposed to being brother and sister. Well, thankfully, due to some very diligent research from author Lee Ralph, it does appear as if the mystery of their true identities has finally been solved. And possibly even their fate. Sort of. In his recent book, Hell Comes to Play, The True Untold Story of America's Mass Murdering Family, Mr. Ralph outlines how he was able to locate the Benders on multiple census records prior to their move to Kansas. I won't bore you with the many details. Check out the book if you'd like to learn more. But long story short, Ralph does make a pretty strong case for the Benders living in Syracuse, New York, as early as 1865, and then moving from there to Decatur, Illinois. And sure enough, if you look at these records, the names and ages all line up. You got John Sr., John Jr., Catherine, a.k.a. Kate, and the matriarch, who, according to Mr. Ralph, was Anna Maria, maiden name Laudermilch. Not Elvira or Almira like you'll see on other sources. Hell, Ralph was even able to determine that they arrived in the United States in 1863 from, wait for it, Le Havre, France. And yes, I am fully aware that I'm butchering that pronunciation. What do you want? This is a history podcast, okay? I'm not a speech therapist. But Josh, I thought you said they were from Germany. Yeah, I did. And if you look at the census records, they're all listed as being born in Germany, except for Kate. She's the only one with France as her place of birth. If you'll recall, the locals there in Kansas did say that she and her father were both known to occasionally speak in La Francais. Kate seemed especially proud of having been born there as opposed to Germany like the rest of her family, and I don't blame her. Only thing worse than being German is Polish. Ugh. One neighbor in particular would even say that Kate claimed to have known Napoleon Bonaparte, even though Napoleon died decades before her birth. Who knows, maybe she spoke to him during one of her little black magic rituals. Now that author, Lee Ralph, well, he kept on digging, and he was able to find an announcement of Kate's birth in the French papers back in February of 1857. He also found the date of birth for John Sr., thanks to Lutheran church records, as well as records of his marriage to Anna in Germany in 1843. Is Lee Ralph doing a little bit of reaching? Maybe. I mean, the names John and Kate aren't exactly all that rare, right? And currently, per the website forebears.io, there are over 100,000 people worldwide with the Bender surname. 54,000 of them reside here in the States, with another 39,000 in Germany, where I can only assume they're busy wearing lederhosen, doing clog dances, and eating sauerkraut. Now, the Benders that Ralph located on that 1865 Syracuse census were most definitely from Germany via France. That much is a fact. I guess the only question is whether or not there are Benders. I do think the possibility is strong, but I'm not sure if there's enough evidence to prove so conclusively. And besides, that still doesn't tell us what became of them, right? Well, as it turns out, shortly after the Benders' disappearance, the New York City Chief of Police received a telegram from Topeka, Kansas. The source claimed that the Benders were planning on boarding a steamer right there in the Big Apple on May 23, 1873. And the ship's destination was, any guesses? Well, if you said Le Havre, France, go ahead and give yourself a pat on the back. That's right, the same place that Lee Ralph showed they were residing before coming to America. What's more, a judge in Kansas would later claim to have received a letter from Kate with a German postmark. But here's the kicker. In November of 1895, a notice appeared in a German-language Swiss newspaper, Der Landblatt, seeking information on the husband and children of Anna Maria Bender, maiden name Laudermilch. Apparently Anna had recently passed away in Kirchhart, Germany, and it was requested that her heirs file a claim on her belongings. Now, if this really is the murderous Maud Bender, then it does appear as if she died alone, hopefully in a lot of pain. But as to whatever became of Paul or John Jr. or Kate, so far as I can tell, nobody's got a fucking clue. So kudos to Lee Ralph for uncovering all this, but I am of the opinion that we still don't have what I would call definitive proof. If I was a betting man, I'd wager that the family he tracked all the way to France and Germany are the real Benders. But even if that is the case, after they made their getaway, we still don't know much, other than Maud Bender possibly dying in 1895. As usual, there's a lot more involved. Check out the book Hell Comes to Play, or one of the many other books out there on the Benders. Another good one is Hell's Half Acre by Susan Janussis. I will warn you, though, that pretty much every one of these authors has their own unique theories, so you may just find yourself getting lost down the rabbit hole. Seriously, there's a ton I didn't even bring up, including the German Bible found inside the cabin with names and dates written in it, the various associates of the Benders, the mysterious John Gerbhardt, stories of them allegedly working hand in hand with stock thieves down in Texas, and a lot more. So if you're looking for a new whodunit to consume all of your free time, you're welcome. And who knows, maybe we'll learn more as time goes on. Back as recently as 2020, part of the land that the Benders once owned was sold at auction to a guy named Bob Miller. And unlike the previous inhabitants, Mr. Miller appears to be a huge history buff, and he's reportedly opening up his property to archaeologists. According to Miller, quote, "We just want to find out what the ground has been hiding for 150 years. End quote, and hell yeah, brother. Here's hoping it's not some sort of ancient curse. And I guess that's about all I've got on the bloody Benders. Sadly, it does not look as if they were ever brought to task for their many gruesome crimes. And who knows, man, maybe they didn't even stay in Europe. Maybe John Jr. and Kate returned to the States. Maybe they had children of their own, little evil inbred children. Maybe you or someone you know, your neighbors perhaps, carry some of that tainted Bender blood flowing through their veins. Maybe they're just biding their time, watching you closely, waiting for you to let your guard down so they can resume the old family tradition. Oh, just one more thing. Thought I'd toss this out there, but there are no known photos existing of any of the Benders. You'll oftentimes stumble upon photos of John Jr. or even Kate, but these are either pictures of those Benders who lived over in Glenwood Springs, Colorado, or just completely fabricated images. I don't know about you, but the entire time I was researching this story, I kept picturing that creepy-ass family from The Devil's Rejects. I think I'd at least be a little disappointed if Paul Bender didn't look exactly like Captain Spaulding. Okay, now that's all I've got on the Benders. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you and yours have a very happy Halloween. Do me a favor, if you enjoyed this episode, why not share it with a friend? Or maybe even an enemy. That'll show them, right? Till next time, try not to murder anybody and bury their bodies in a garden, okay? I don't care how big your tomatoes are, I'm not eating no damn produce out of a death garden. Also, don't go trying to talk to dead people. And whatever you do, do not sit with your back to a curtain. Adios.